Turn the lights back on. Wow. Retro electro tech. When real audio ruled the world.
Greetings once again, ladies and gentlemen. This is Retro Ernest of Retro Electrotech. And pardon the background noise, I'm running the heat hard and heavy today. It's very, very cold here in Maine. It's snowing and all that stuff, so there you have it. What I have here on the bench today is another Sansui 771. Some of you may recall that I did do a initial evaluation video on this unit when I took it in a couple months back, and I've been bouncing back and forth again between other pieces of equipment I'm working on, so I'm getting back to this now. But also too, there was another issue that I was diagnosing that took some time to diagnose because it was a very, very intermittent, infrequent noise problem, and I'll get into that a little bit more later. But nonetheless, I'm back at it. Now, when I initially took this unit in, I did so with a customer complaint that there was some kind of a power-up issue. I think the customer mentioned he was experiencing some kind of noise that sounded kind of scary. I really don't know what he was referring to, because of course I powered this unit up safely on the current limiter, dim bulb tester, whatever you want to refer to it as, and not a single hiccup. Okay, I cautiously worked my way through the power supply of this receiver very carefully and very thoroughly, checking everything out, making sure that all of the voltages were sitting where they should be sitting, that nothing was behaving, erratically, as far as, any odd voltage fluctuations, any surging, anything getting hotter than it should. Now, in the power supply, you have some things that run a bit warm, past transistors, things like that, and so forth. I'm not going to get into all that detail in this video, but I did go through very carefully and monitored everything, and again, not a single hiccup. Everything is stable. So I really don't know what the customer experienced. I'm sure he probably experienced something, but from what I recall, it had been a very long time since he had powered this unit up. So other than that, what I determined to be a problem in this receiver, and I mentioned this in the initial evaluation video on this, was that there was a big time lack of tuner sensitivity. In other words, it was not pulling in any stations. Now, on that note, some of you may also recall that in that initial evaluation video, I discovered some very, very ugly solder joints underneath this section here of this tuner board, and there were actually several components in this area that were a bit loose because of bad solder joints, including the way this tuning condenser was mounted, the mounting posts and the way that it was soldered in. These solder joints were really, really bad around the back side here. And anyways, everything's resolved now, but yeah, in this area here and underneath this equalizer board here, up under here, yeah, several bad solder joints. It looked like a 2-year-old was in here attempting to solder things. So I don't know how that came about, who was in here. If that was something that took place at the factory, then they were obviously having a really bad day. Somebody was having a bad day, but whatever the case, I cleaned everything up. And as I also mentioned in that initial evaluation video, after that I was able to pull in stations. It was pulling in stations pretty darn good. It still is. So I'll get back to that after I perform some additional work in here and check the alignment, make sure everything's looking good. If the alignment is okay, I'm not going to go into that because I only have so much of a budget to work within. So I'm just going to leave it at that. But if it needs to be aligned, then I will do so. But moral of the story is, at this point, I'm in the recapping phase, and I'm going to get more into that and kind of go into some tips and some discussion about the recapping process, especially for those newer to the task. And some of you old pros and veterans and all that, you may want to X out or just fast forward or whatever the case. But I'm just going to kind of go into that. But one thing I do want to mention is that the reason why it took a while, once again, to get to this point is because, as I mentioned earlier, I was tracking down a problem involving what turned out to be a transistor here in the, let me just go ahead and, oops, you didn't see that, but anyways, involving these differential pairs here in the, on the driver board. One of these 2SC 726 transistors was exhibiting some noise, and it was so infrequent, like I said, and just so intermittent that it just took a while to track it down. Okay, so anyways, that's kind of what it came down to. And one thing I want to mention real quick is that those 2SC 726 transistors have a reputation, from what I understand, of being problematic. They get noisy with age, they get leaky and all that, so you may just want to make note of that. But anyways, I'm going to move on and get into some more recapping and some tips and a few things that might prove helpful to some. So let's go ahead and get to it. Okay, so I'm going to touch on some pointers that may help some of you younger cats out there, or maybe not even younger, just some of you newer cats, get through the process of recapping a piece of equipment. And it's not only applicable to recapping, this can carry over to just any kind of component replacement and all that, just navigating your way through a piece of equipment and just replacing components. But right now we're focusing on electrolytics because that's what I'm performing right now, as a partial electrolytic recap, and I'll get more into that as we go. But why electrolytics? Well, I've explained before that electrolytic capacitors are higher failure components, and that's just on account of their very nature. And I'm not going to get into details concerning their modes of failure and so forth, but they're not as resilient as other types of capacitors that you find in equipment, and in this case audio equipment, such as the various poly caps, film caps, and ceramics and so forth. So so that's why we're covering what we're covering right now, or why I'm kind of focusing on electrolytics. So on that note, I want to start with briefly going over electrolytic capacitor selection. And in short, just choose good quality caps. And there's a lot of different caps out there, but for example, like Nishikons, Rubicons, Nippon Chemicon, United Chemicon, Cornell Dubliers, there's all kinds of caps out there, Sprague's and F&T, Fisher and Tausch, German caps, and all these caps out there. Try to use good caps, and that's not to say that you have to, get pulled into all of the, that audiophile craze of, $100 per cap kind of thing. It's not necessary. That's not saying that those type of caps aren't good quality caps. It's just that you don't need to spend that kind of money to obtain good sonic characteristics in regard to electrolytic capacitors and so forth. So anyways, just be aware of that. It's your choice in the end. Experiment with what you want to experiment with, but just use good quality caps nonetheless. For example, I have this driver board in view here, and I haven't soldered in these caps yet. They're kind of wobbling all around, but I'll get to that when I get to it. But this was the only section or board in this receiver here that was recapped, and it was probably recapped some time back. But anyways, I found that this board was recapped with these, you see these blue caps here, they're these Zycon branded caps. There was also these Jamicon or Jamicon caps, whatever, which are not necessarily held in high esteem. They don't have the finest reputation around. that's not to say that every series of electrolytic capacitor or capacitor that these companies put out are bad, but there's a reason why I use top quality capacitors when I work on a customer's piece of equipment or my own, and that's because, you know, these manufacturers like, you know, Pioneer, Marantz, Sansui, Kenwood, and so forth, there's a reason why they used the capacitors that they used, why they selected the capacitors that they used. They knew what they were doing, number one, you know, and they really did use fine capacitors in you know, this equipment from that golden age of audio. Okay, and so again, just use high quality caps. I always use high quality caps. You know, I have Nishikons and Panasonics throughout, so I just wanted to mention that. Also too, along those lines, it's not a one-size-fits-all thing when it comes to installing capacitors or performing an electrolytic recap or any kind of recap for that matter, whether it's electrolytics or something else. It's not a one-size-fits-all scenario. You need to know what type of cap you're putting in to a particular area of a, you know, piece of equipment, a particular part of the circuit. You know, for example, this cap here, this 0.47 50 volt cap, is directly in the audio path, and you can see here it ties right into the base of this transistor here, which comprises this differential pair, but that's neither here nor there. The point is, it falls directly in the audio path, so you want to use a low noise, you know, high quality audio grade cap in this position, for example. So that's kind of what I want to point out. You know, it's not a one size fits all thing, so just know what you're installing within a particular piece of equipment and within a particular part of the circuit. Okay, so anyways, let's go ahead and move on. So before we start replacing capacitors, as I mentioned, I'm already partially into it, but before we start moving further and pulling caps out, installing caps and all that, let's talk about a few options for removing components from the board, desoldering in other words. So what I have laid out here on the bench is just a few things I use in the shop, and you know, of course, the desoldering gun is a nice thing to have, and you know, this though, you'll probably be into it anywhere between, I would say, $2.50 to, you know, just under $300. And I'm sure if you shop around, you can find a deal on one of these. You know, they vary, but I think I paid like $270 something for this. I'm sure if I would have shopped around more, I probably could have got it, you know, a little bit cheaper than that. But anyways, then you have the little or big, actually, sucky solder sucky, it rub you wrong time, you know, this thing. And it, you know, it's okay. It's not my favorite tool to use because, again, unlike, you know, although the body isn't as bulky on this sucky pump as the desoldering gun, it still is, you know, wider in diameter compared to the nozzle of this gun. So sometimes trying to get it into certain areas, tight spaces, again, is also a challenge. So usually what I like to use is this solder wick here, okay? Because I can maneuver it in, you know, with my soldering iron. My soldering iron's a little bit thinner, of course, and, you know, with the soldering iron tip and some solder wick, I find that I can get into tighter spots a little bit better. Again, you know, it's just a few different methods I use, so I'm going to demonstrate that. But also one thing I want to show you real quick is another thing that I'm not a big fan of with these sucky pumps is they're a little bit clumsy, okay, because of the way you have to angle them in order to you know, achieve suction, and you have a solder joint there, and you know, you're manipulating the iron tip onto the solder joint, and you know, you got to kind of get that angle just right, and anyways, sometimes it could be a little clumsy. Also too, when you have to recock this thing, I just call it, cocking the, just cock it like a gun. And anyways, the way that I do it, because you're obviously working one-handed with this pump while you have the soldering iron in the other hand. So what I like to do when I'm gonna recock it is just kind of flip it and then hit it against my thigh. And let me just kind of show you that real quick. So I just kind of ram it against my thigh, and then here's a little button here, and then ram it against my thigh. That's how I do it anyways. And I'm going to demonstrate all this stuff as we start desoldering. So let's go ahead and move on to what I refer to as landmarking the component. Okay, so let's say that we want to remove C7 right here. I'm just going to remove C7, C8. I already recapped some of these up here. I'm just kind of working my way, over and down and what have you, but that's not important. But anyways, so C7 and C8, we'll start with C7. So let me go ahead and see if I can get this into view here. If I have the information available, okay, and maybe I should back this out a little bit. Let me see here. Yeah, let me just do this. Okay, and point this down. Okay, if I have this information available, it's really helpful as far as landmarking components that I'm going to pull out, because as you can see here, this shows us, let me see, let me zoom in actually a little closer. Okay, so this shows us the position of C7 and C8 on the back of the board. Okay, so this would be the conductor side or foil side, the trace side, whatever, on the back of the board as to, and in relation to where the components are positioned. So when we get around to the back side to remove C7 and C8, we can study the trace anatomy, if you will, and we'll know right, where the pins are. Another thing too that I'm going to mention that will prove helpful to you, and again, a lot of you guys already know this, so this isn't really geared for you old pros, but if you're watching, more power to you. That's cool, no problem. But also too, you'll notice that here's our negative stripe right here on the bottom side of C7, and our positive is up on top. So make note of that when you're pulling caps out, whether the pins are running vertical or horizontally. In this case, we know that our pins, when we spin this around, are going to be running vertically. Okay, so here we are around the back side, and I'm going to zoom in just a minute, obviously, but you can see we got this wire in the way in the general area where I'm going to be working and desoldering and all that, somewhat, anyways. So we don't want to. We want to avoid burning wires and all that, whether it's with this desoldering gun or with a soldering iron, whatever. That's the thing. When you have a lot of wires in an area, you have to be really careful. In this case, there's not a lot of wires in this area, but when I start getting up into here and and I start performing some desoldering and soldering and all that, the way that I keep wires out of the way, yeah, you can desolder them, you can label them, desolder them, and just move them out of the way. But sometimes if I just want to move them out of the way real quick, I'll use something like a rubber band, just go around, kind of girth hitch it, whatever, and then just use a rubber band like that, kind of pull them out of the way. I have this little heat sink fin here, so I'll just kind of attach it on there. Again, common sense, you don't want to pull too tight and start ripping things out, but it just kind of helps to hold the wire out of the way. There's more than one way to skin a cat, so This is just what I use. Sometimes I have different sizes of rubber bands in the shop. You could use a piece of string. It doesn't matter. Just do a little hitch around the wires, pull it, and I like rubber bands because, you know, the elasticity of them and just whatever. So now the wires are kind of out of my way when I'm working here if I want to move them this way again. But just be careful when you're moving them around, and then you can you know, hook this to whatever, the underside of this board, you know, just whatever, a little common sense, a little ingenuity. So that's that. So let me go ahead and zoom in on this board here. If we study these traces here just briefly, around C7 right here, okay? If you study these traces, okay, these ones here, this, and, you know, obviously we're gonna, you know, and, you know, we've got this, you know, these large areas here too, these large traces and what have you. And this is what we're going to use to landmark the position of that cap. Again, you know, this seems kind of long and all that because I'm explaining it. But of course, when I'm just working off of the service data here and just kind of glancing at it, spinning this thing around, this happens really quick, okay? So it's a lot faster than it appears. Again, just take a look at the traces and then compare them with... Look familiar? Are your memories fantastic and you can remember what we looked at on the in the service manual versus these traces here? Okay, so here's our C7 pins here. Remember, they're running vertically. And our C8 here, okay? So anyways, I'm going to get to desoldering them. I'm probably going to try to back the camera out just a little bit because I have the camera right up on the bench on a little tripod, and it's going to be a little bit clumsier for me to try to work around it, but I may give it a try though so that you can kind of see what I'm doing here. So anyways, let's go ahead and get to it. Okay, so first I'm just going to use the desoldering pump, desoldering gun, and hopefully I can maneuver in here okay. And with, you know, you got to give consideration to your dwell time, of course. You don't want to camp out on the solder joint any longer than need be. You know, a couple seconds is obviously recommended. Now, what makes it a little bit difficult in this case, and not really difficult, but you'll see what I'm talking about in just a moment. A lot of these pins are folded over, and unless you, let me set this soldering gun down and kind of, yeah, the back of the camera is a little bit blurry. Let me see if I can back this off just a little bit and achieve better focus. That's a problem with this camera, you know, when you try to zoom in too much, you really just, yeah, it kind of blurs and all that stuff. So anyway, so pardon that. I'm doing the best I can. So with what I have to work with anyways. So you can see me pointing here. This is the solder joint that I just desoldered, and the pin is folded over, lying pretty much flat on the pad. Now, if you're not careful and you don't get all that solder out from underneath the pin and you try to bend it upwards and straighten it out so you can pull the component out, in this case the electrolytic cap, then you risk lifting the pad, and that's not a good thing. It's not the end of the world if something like that happened. You know, pads can be replaced, repaired, but again, it's just burning up more time. So let's try to work efficiently here. So sometimes you have to get the soldering iron in there, or, you know, sometimes I just use a desoldering pump because obviously, being that it's a desoldering pump, the nozzle is hollow in the center. So sometimes I will just, you know, kind of very carefully bend the pin while I have the desoldering gun in contact with the pin, so that, you know, the solder underneath, of course, melts. And then I kind of pry the pin up. Now I know there's going to be some that, oh, you know, you're using your soldering gun as a pry bar, and they're going to get all hysterical and all that. But in all honesty, there's textbook and there's reality. When you have pins, you know, or you can try getting it with a pair of flush cutters. But one way or the other, though, you do want to at least hold your soldering iron on there just so that solder will melt, and then bend the pin up, excuse me. But you don't want to try to pull it up if there's hard solder underneath the pin, because you're going to pull the pad up. So just apply a little bit of apply some heat, get the soldering iron in there, or in this case I'll use a desoldering pump and just kind of bend it upwards. So that's what I'm going to do real quick, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. It's not a big deal. I've done it 10,000 times before, and so I'm just, see, the pin is bending, and that's it. It's done. The pin is now bent away from the pad. I just kind of work it under the pin just a little bit and just kind of lift it up very carefully. You don't want to just give it a yank and end up, in other words, just work smart. That's the point. And so I don't recommend using soldering irons and desoldering guns as pry bars and prying pins up, but sometimes you got to get under there just a little bit and bring it up while you have heat, melting the solder on the pin, under the pin, and just bring it up, and then you're good to go. So let me go ahead and move forward. I'm going to get the other pin done. And the camera's right here in my path, so I'm doing the best I can here. Okay, and let me just, there we go. Okay, so, and at the same time I kind of just bent the pin up a little bit. Yeah, when these pins are bent flat against the pad, it's kind of a pain in the butt. So anyways, I'm going to pull this cap out, and let's see if we got it. Okay, and here's that C7 cap, and you can see it's loose in the caboose and ready to come out. And here we have it. Okay, so not a problem. And just remember too, I want to repeat again, because I know sometimes there's going to be people that are going to comment and say, oh well, that's risky, prying pins up like that with a soldering iron. You can you can damage the tip on your soldering iron, and you should be careful. You don't want to be scraping up the tip of your soldering iron, using it as a a pry bar and all that. But it's more of just lifting the pin, okay? Because and there's other ways you can do that too. Again, you can work a very thin pair of flush cutters under there while you're holding the soldering iron on the pin real quick, just to melt the solder and just give it a little lift. But again, I'm comfortable doing that because I've done it a lot. I'm a pretty coordinated person, so I do that very carefully to get those pins straightened out. Okay, so anyways, let's go ahead and remove this cap next. Okay, C8, and this time I'm going to use the sucky pump, and we'll use that method, and then we'll go on to another cap and use some solder wick, and that way you can see the the difference and so forth. And again, not rocket science, not a big deal, not a big revelation, but anyways, let's go ahead and move on. Okay, so here we are around the back side once again, and this is the C7 cap that we just desoldered here, and this is C8, the next one we're going to do. Now, in regard to landmarking, what I was referring to a little bit ago to help locate the position of the component, we use the data in the service manual, and it again, in review, it showed us what where it was located on the back side here, based on the conductor side, the foil side, and so forth and so on, as I already explained. So what if we didn't have that available? What's another good way that we can landmark the other cap's position if we didn't know where it was? Now, we know it's this one, but let me just go ahead and show you sometimes what I also do when I don't have service data available and the board permits me to do so. Let me go ahead and show you real quick. So a lot of times I'll just use my trusty old mag light, and I like it because it's got a little bit of a narrower profile. So when I'm placing the light over a component on the other side of the board, it gives me a little bit more of a narrow beam, and it just kind of fits over the components a little bit better. And because it's usually the smaller components anyways, obviously, that you're trying to kind of landmark and distinguish where they are in relation to all the other, you know, solder joints and all that. Especially on a densely populated board, it can get a little bit overwhelming, but again, not a big deal. So you take your light, and I'm going to go ahead and turn the lights down in the shop so you can see what I'm talking about. So you can see the light there, right, moving around on the back side of that cap. So it at least gets us in the ballpark. Sometimes it's nice to have a light with a little bit more intensity. These little mag lights, these little mini mags, aren't very bright, but it works good enough for me, especially on this type of a board. But you can see that light moving around on the back side of the cap. So that's kind of a good way you can landmark the position of the component you're going to be desoldering. So there you go. That's just another way. And sometimes you could just put your finger on top of it, you know, reach over the top there, put your finger on it and kind of guesstimate more or less. And also too, we also know that the pins are running vertically. So that tells us something too. So just, you know, use a little bit of creativity there, and when you're landmarking your components, and you'll be able to navigate your way through and desolder and all that good stuff. So let's go ahead and move on and get this other cap desoldered using the sucky pump. Okay, so start out with a little solder on the tip there. Okay, that got it pretty good. Now let me recock the sucky and then get a little more solder on the tip here. Okay, because it just helps the solder joint to get underway here. Okay, here we are. All right, so we got that, and that's looking pretty good. It got it okay, but we still need to be really careful with those pins there. And remember, the dwell time is really important. You don't want to camp out on the joint too long. So if you do have to go back in to, you know, heat up the lead a little bit more to bend that lead up a little bit, bend it, you know, forward so you can get the component out, then just return with your soldering iron and you know, a few extra seconds or so. Just give it time to kind of cool down, because again, you don't want to camp out on the solder joint too long. So just keep that in mind, your dwell time. And I know this camera's not focusing super well because, you know, again, trying to zoom in up close, it just doesn't work real good. But let me just kind of point it out. Again, these are the two solder joints for C8, and they look pretty good. You know, the solder, you know, that sucky pump worked pretty good. It pulled it off pretty nice. Again, start out with, you know, putting some solder on the tip. It'll get things flowing nice, and then suck it out of there. So anyways, when I was kind of straightening them out with the needle nose pliers, I can feel that the cap is already loose, so it's ready to come out as a point. So let's go ahead and move on to another cap using the solder wick. And here's our C8 cap, all nice and loose. And here we go. Okay, so our next cap, C9, is right here. Okay, these two pins, they also run vertically here. And anyways, I'm going to use this solder wick here. So let me go ahead, and all I'm going to do is apply the solder wick over the joint there. And I like solder wick. It really does a very clean job. So that's about it. Now let me go ahead and back this out here while I spin this around. And you can already see, if I zoom in, that cap is already almost falling out, you see. C9. And there we have it. And no damage caused. Again, keep in mind your dwell time. If you have to kind of keep working the leads a little bit because they're folded over, just go in. If you could, you know, bend them one time really quick while you have this soldering iron in contact with whatever you're using, whether you're using just a little tiny screwdriver or something similar, just to bend the pin up and out of the way, or whatever you're using. If you get it the first time and that corresponds well to your dwell time and you can get off the pad fast enough, fine. If not, just back off for a little bit, let things cool down, go back in and do it again. Just don't sit on the pad too long, or else that's going to cause it to lift and whatnot, and you know, you don't want to overheat things and all that stuff. So just a little bit of advice there. And that's about it, guys. I'm going to continue this all by my lonesome and get the rest of the recapping done. There's not a lot of caps that I'm doing on the power board, and you know, I am going to remove these filters and all that and replace them with these Cornell Doubliers here. But other than that, there's not too many more caps that I'm going to do. So that's about it. Anyways, thank you for hanging, and you know, I hope some of this proved to be useful for you. And otherwise, you guys take care of yourselves. Till next time, like I always say, peace, love, rock and roll, and of course, vintage audio.
This is a poor man's shoe production.